Good afternoon. My name is Frank Gaffney. I'm the president of the Center for Security Policy here in Washington, D.C., and I'm very pleased to be sponsoring this, well, we call it Truth Squad on Iran. There has been, as all of you know, a considerable amount of disinformation, I think it's fair to say, certainly confusing statements and dissembling statements at that have been offered up most recently, I guess, in the State of the Union address by the President of the United States concerning where things stand with respect to Iran, with respect specifically to negotiations with Iran, with respect to its nuclear weapons program, and I think to the future trajectory that the President has in mind for a relationship past that negotiated outcome. What we are talking about today is the context in which those kinds of conversations, those kinds of negotiations, those kinds of representations are being made. Our view, those of my distinguished colleagues and our special featured guest, Congressman Trent Franks, are somewhat at odds, shall we say, with the statements that the President and other administration spokesmen have been making about Iran. We think at the very minimum, these are the sorts of alternative assessments that are needed for the American people and their elected representatives to have under consideration as they weigh not only these negotiations that are underway with the Iranians and the so-called PERM 5+1, but also with respect to legislation that is expected to be addressed by the Congress on both sides of the aisle, on both sides of the Hill in the days to come, namely legislation that would respond to the unhappy reality that these negotiations have not been working out very satisfactorily, to say the least. We will have a series of speakers who will address us briefly. We will then break and have an opportunity for questions from the audience and discussion among them. I just want to say at the outset again how appreciative I am to Congressman Franks and to my friends and colleagues at the Center for Security Policy for joining us on fairly short notice, and to, of course, all of you, both the live streamed audience and those of you in the room, for coming together to have what I consider to be an extraordinarily important and timely conversation. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce Congressman Franks. He has business to attend to elsewhere, so we're very pleased to have him here even with us briefly. There is, by my lights, no member of either the House or Senate who is more knowledgeable, more thoughtful, more engaged on issues of national security than Congressman Franks. He is, as you know, I'm sure, a senior member of the House Armed Services Committee. He is also the chairman of the Constitution Subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee. He co-chairs a very important caucus in the House, the Congressional Electromagnetic Pulse, or EMP caucus, and he has been very, very engaged over his entire tenure in the Congress on matters involving deterrence and protecting this country against the threat of nuclear attack, whether it's of the form of EMP or the old-fashioned kind. And it is a distinct privilege to have him with us to kick off this conversation about the truth about Iran and what we need to be doing in light of the realities that we currently face, if indeed we're prepared to face them. Congressman Franks, welcome to you, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Well, I'm just extremely grateful to be with you all. I know that all of you know a great deal about Center for Security Policy already, but I have to suggest to you that of all the groups that I have the privilege of working with and interacting with as a member of the Armed Services Committee and the Strategic Forces Committee here, subcommittee, I truly believe that whatever you're doing to help Center for Security Policy is a vital contribution, because they are one of the leading voices in America and the world, really, for the cause of true human freedom. And I can't express to you how thankful I am just to be able to stand here among all of you and express what I think is just some comments on the dynamics that Iran represents to the world and the peace of the human family. I would suggest to you that Iran's nuclear pursuits are one of the most critically significant and grave threats to the peace of the world that we have anywhere to discuss. I know there are a lot of people that suggest that it's going to be very costly to prevent Iran from gaining a nuclear weapons capability, and my response to that has consistently been, yes, it will. But it will pale in comparison to the cost in making sure that we can overcome them once they have a nuclear weapons capability. To deal with a nuclear-capable Iran is an unthinkable scenario. Now, quickly, our office was one of the premier committed offices to making sure that we didn't sign a bad deal with Iran on this interim thing. We tried very hard to run ahead of it and to have a resolution in the Congress to make sure that at least Congress was on record. We were not able to effect that, and of course the interim agreement did occur. But keep in mind, there's a couple things about that interim agreement that I think are very significant. One, in spite of all of the UN resolutions saying that Iran had to build down and take away dismantle their capacity to enrich uranium or to produce plutonium, under the interim agreement, there is a protected protocol to enrich uranium. It's astonishing to me, and especially since, in ultimate terms, ladies and gentlemen, that's the whole ballgame. If Iran can enrich uranium or produce plutonium, they're on their way to becoming a nuclear-armed nation if they choose to be. They don't need any more personnel. They don't need any more technology. They don't need any more materials. All Iran needs to gain a nuclear weapons capability is time. And this administration seems, unfortunately, either naively or just insanely willing to allow them to have that time. And I am extremely concerned about it. It brings me to one of the principal thoughts that I wanted to make today, and that is related to Iran and nuclear EMP. A lot of us understand that once Iran gains a nuclear weapons capability, that they will also have an EMP capability. What people probably don't realize is how much they have focused on it themselves. We just have a little book here that was translated by the National Intelligence University that was essentially the doctrine of Iran on this issue. They pointed out that the grids and infrastructure were critically important targets for EMP in this country, and that EMP represented, in their mind, a very effective advanced mechanism of warfare. If they're that far ahead of us, if they're thinking that far ahead of us, and we are still as vulnerable as we can be, then I think that there's room for a lot of discussion. One of the things that they did, they mentioned EMP as a weapons mechanism more than 20 times in this little book, and we've gone through it, and it just astonishes me that we're not talking about that a lot more than we are. It sort of idealizes General Vladimir Slipchenko, which is Russia's leading thinker on EMP warfare. This is something they're really talking about and thinking about a lot as an offensive capability. And keep in mind, with the missile technology that they have, there is always astonishing. Now I can finally say it. They say as early as 2015, they might have the ability to have a longer range missile capability. Well, the last I checked, 2015 got here. And so this is a much more urgent issue than I think anybody recognizes. And I just have to say to you folks, I think that as concerned as we should all be, that we should have a great deal of hope and just a sense that things are moving in a good direction. Thanks to the enormous help of Center for Security Policy, and I do mean that. Behind the scenes, there have been no group more effective. We were able to see the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act, CIPA, pass in the House last year. And I absolutely believe it will pass again this year, and that it has an excellent chance to pass the Senate. We have a very favorable chairman of the new Senate Homeland Security Committee, Ron Johnson. He understands the significance of this issue, and I think we're moving in a good direction. Ultimately, my hope is to see the SHIELD Act passed, because it does really two things. It says that we need a national standard to harden our grid against EMP, and there's nothing we can do, incidentally, more important to deter a potential enemy from using this type of attack against us than hardening our infrastructure. If we do that, then the chances of them having that fatal capability or that enormous impact upon us is so diminished that it no longer makes sense for them strategically to do it. So it's you know, I chair the Missile Defense Caucus in this Congress, and I believe in it more than anyone does. But let me suggest to you that even missile defense is not as important as hardening our grid when it comes to deterring a potential enemy against attacking our grid with the use of EMP. The second thing the SHIELD Act does is it says we want hardware-based solutions to protect our grid. It's notable that our military and our defense apparatus has spent literally billions of dollars in the last many decades to harden our critical defense apparatus against electromagnetic pulse. We never have to argue with the generals, whether it's hardening our missile defense capability or our nuclear triad or other critical defense assets. We never seem to have to argue with them because they understand the reality. Our challenge is to get the civilian grid to understand that they are vulnerable to this in a significant way. The good news is, because of men like Terry Boston, others that are great captains of industry, we're seeing that occur now. And once again, Center for Security Policy, I'm not trying to be I'm not a salesman, I don't get a commission here. But I will tell you that the Center for Security Policy is at the forefront of making this issue not only real in the minds of people it needs to be real in, but they are making sure that we're promoting and passing legislation that will make the critical difference. And my hope is that, you know, as I remind everyone, that there's that moment in the life of every problem when it's big enough to be seen. And if Iran's nuclear ambitions are not big enough to be seen now, I don't think they ever will be, and still small enough to be addressed. I think that window is closing. I think this administration, if Iran does gain nuclear weapons capability, will go down in history as the administration that allowed it to happen. And I think it's up to you and me to make sure that it doesn't, and to harden our infrastructure against EMP attacks so that no matter what happens, that someday when there is that, whether it's a geomagnetic disturbance of significant proportion or someone tries to attack this country using EMP, that the effect will be so small that only a few of us will really realize what a disaster was averted. So God bless you all. Thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for Center for Security Policy. Thank you for your part in, and thank especially for this one Frank Gaffney here. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you, Congressman, and as always, Godspeed on your various functions. I know you have to slip out, but we're very pleased to have you with us even for a brief period. Let me ask a friend and colleague of many years who has fortuitously found himself in Washington serendipitously at a moment when I think it would be enormously helpful to have his contribution from his unique perspective on this issue of the actual threat that we're facing, all of us, from Iran. He is Ambassador Yoram Ettinger of Israel. Ambassador Ettinger has served in a number of different capacities, the government of Israel, including representing them here in the United States, specifically with the rank of ambassador to the liaison function with the United States Congress. He is a man of extraordinary vision when it comes to the strategic challenges of our time. And I asked him to stop by in the midst of his rounds on Capitol Hill today to share with us the frontline perspective, if you will, of the Jewish state that is, of course, fully in the crosshairs of this Iranian regime. They make no bones about their ambition to wipe Israel off the map. Even as they talk about the great Satan, they're most immediately, unfortunately, focused on what they call the little Satan. They'll get to us in due course, as the Congressman suggested. Mr. Ambassador, it's a delight to have you with us. Please come on up and give us a short course on how this Iranian threat appears from the perspective of the people of Israel. Welcome.
Thank you.
Good to have you with us.
Thank you very much. Irrespective of Israel's policies, irrespective, independent of Israel's existence, Iran has made its mind set to develop the mega capability nuclear in order to advance its mega historical goal, which is domination of the Persian Gulf, and with the aim of removing the only effective mega obstacle, namely America's power projection in the Persian Gulf, in the Indian Ocean, and in the Middle East. All that has absolutely nothing to do with Israel. Iran obviously is a lethal threat to Israel, but the motivation of becoming a nuclear power is focused on much more important factor as far as they're concerned, and that is the USA. And according to what I would call the fact base, guilty until proven innocent school of thought, and in contrast with the hope base, fact dismissing innocent until proven guilty school of thought, according to the guilty until proven innocent school of thought, nuclear Iran would compound dramatically the clear and present and lethal threat to vital American interest, vital interest of Western democracies, lethal threat to Israel, as well as to Saudi Arabia and other pro-American Arab regimes in the Middle East. And anybody who studies the track record of Iran must conclude that Iran is not going to shy away from using the nuclear capability. A regime which was willing to sacrifice 500,000 children on the altar of clearing minefields during the war against Iraq in the 1980s may not be shy or may not have compunction about using nuclear capabilities, elements. Moreover, the idea that one can contain a nuclear Iran, the idea that one can tolerate a nuclear threshold Iran, does contradict, again, the track record of Iran. And if briefly one were to highlight the track record of Iran, primarily we're talking about the most Shiite country in the entire world, which believes firmly and educates and follows policies which highlight the principles of submission of humanity to Muhammad, the submission of the infidel to the Sharia laws, the belief that any Muslim must commit to jihad, holy war, in order to advance the goals of Islam, the idea that land is divinely ordained by Allah to Muslims, the principle of Islam which they follow devoutedly, that we are talking about a confrontation between the abode of Islam, the residence of the believers, and the abode of the Al-Harb, namely the Dar Al-Harb, the residence of the disbelievers who must be dealt with a sword. And last and not least, according to Islam, which Iran in general and Rouhani, the president in particular, excel in, and that is the Islamic art of double talking, deceptive-based type of dialogue and agreements with the infidel in order to shield or advance the goals of the believers. And when you expand those principles upon which the revolution established itself back in 1979, 1980, one can realize how come Iran is the #1 sponsor of Islamic terrorism throughout the world. And how come Iran is spreading subversion and terrorism within the Gulf among the different pro-American Arab oil-producing countries? And we can understand why is Iran collaborating with North Korea in the development of missile ballistic capabilities, developing jointly missiles, long-range missiles, which today can already reach Europe, and eventually, according to Iranian plan, they could reach the USA. And certainly one can understand what took place only a few days ago in Yemen, where with the help of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and weaponry and training and money, the Shiite minority, the Houthis, have become the dominant element in Yemen. Now, mind you, Yemen has traditionally been the invasion route to Saudi Arabia. President Nasser of Egypt did that during the 1960s. The 67 war of Israel was not only great victory for Israel, but through that victory, we also accorded the Saudis a great sigh of relief, because they were on the verge of being eliminated by Egypt through Yemen. Iran is following in the footsteps of Nasser. The aim is to direct a dagger into Riyadh. You become dominant in Yemen, you're dominant in over the access from the Indian Ocean to the Red Sea and through the Red Sea to Europe. This is the route of the major oil tankers and other large vessels. If you dominate Yemen, you're right next to Oman, which is targeted by Iran. And as you know, it's Oman and Iran which jointly control the only access from the Persian Gulf to the wide open sea. And certainly, we're talking about Iran's ties with Venezuela, with Argentina, and through the Venezuela, Ecuador, and Bolivia, and all that with a conventional Iran. How emboldened are they going to be in Caracas when their partner becomes nuclear? Iran already has missiles on Venezuelan soil. What would stop the radical anti-American regime in Venezuela from asking the Iranians to deploy some nuclear systems to Venezuela, and how difficult it would be to deploy to a metropolitan area in the USA? And why should anybody assume that the Iranians would shy away from smuggling some nuclear system devices on a seemingly innocent vessel docking at the port of Baltimore or Mobile or Long Beach or New York? And what impact would that have on American homeland security? And certainly we're talking about U.S. posture of deterrence, which already is at the bottom of the last few years. How eroded it's going to be facing a nuclear Iran, because I cannot see any tenant in the White House, be it the most hawkish, engaged in a who blinks first nuclear contest. No American president would dare the Iranians to launch only one nuclear warhead and to be targeted for retribution by hundreds of nuclear warheads. And therefore, the conclusion is very obvious. Once you have a nuclear Iran, the only question would be how rapid and how wide in scope will American concessions be in the Gulf, in the Middle East, in the Indian Ocean, Latin America, and beyond. And the conclusion, once again, as I said at the beginning, we are not talking about primarily an Israeli issue. This is primarily an American as well as an Israeli issue. And I think it's very important to realize that, because when you do something for another person, you marshal some of your resources. But when you realize that the machete is getting closer and closer to your own throat, then you marshal all your resources to take care of that machete. And last and not least, how does one deal with such a problem? We don't need to be a great scientist or psychologist. There are recent precedents. 1988, a ceasefire agreement was signed between Iran and Iraq. Iran until then did not want to talk about ceasefire. And suddenly they were very hasty to sign because an American president decided to bomb and take quite a toll on the side of the Iranians, and whether purposely or inadvertently, also a civilian Iranian plane was bombed, was shut down, and some 300 or so Iranian civilians were killed, and that brought Khomeini right away to the table, signing a ceasefire, because that's how you deal with bullies in your neighborhood or in the global neighborhood. And certainly we had the precedent of 2003 when overnight supposedly American tanks appeared in the streets of Baghdad. They managed to also hunt Saddam Hussein, and right away Gaddafi publicly said, "I'm giving up my nuclear infrastructure." Iran was very quick to say, "We are suspending our drive for nuclear." Assad was scared for his survival until a visit by Secretary of State Colin Powell, and then he realized it's not a Doberman, it's a poodle, and why should I be concerned about that? And so did Iran, and hence the development. And I think the conclusion is to reverse it and to learn from history not by repeating mistakes as this administration is doing, but rather by avoiding mistakes and face that regime in a very, very determined manner. And it seems to me that, with all due respect to sanctions, but until there is a regime change, the threat or the wrath of nuclear Iran and the catastrophic damage to American interests will still dominate the timetable in this country. Thank you very much.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for that sort of strategic overview. We appreciate you being here, and if you can stick around, would love to have your participation. If not, we understand that your time is limited. Let me introduce, through a small miracle, in person, as opposed to what we thought we were going to have to do due to the inclement weather up in his neck of New England, Dr. Andrew Bostom. Andrew is, I'm fond of saying, really a polymath, a Renaissance man, by training and profession, a physician, clinician, but one of the world's foremost experts as well on Sharia, on jihad, and on anti-Semitism, the author of a number of books, some of which are on display here. We've asked Andrew to join us to talk about the character of this regime. Our previous speakers addressed it a little bit, but you really can't understand what we're up against and how serious the gravity of the mistake we're making in believing that this negotiating process can produce a desired result unless you understand the character of the regime. So with that, Dr. Bostom, welcome. It's good to have you with us, sir.
Thanks. So as per my wont, I prepared much more material than I could ever possibly present. So I will just give you the barest bones outlines, and maybe we can have some discussion. Sebastian, you can get me the next slide, please. So, interestingly enough, the recent Hebdo murders in Paris, targeting journalists, and even more egregiously without cause Jews at a kosher market, represent uniquely Islamic phenomena, certainly in the present era. Blasphemy killings, and lethal religiously inspired Muslim Jew hatred. Islam's prophet had his own Dead Poets Society comprised of mockers whose assassinations he directly ordered or sanctioned, at least 10 explicit cases, including prominently Jews. A canonical hadith or tradition of Muhammad states, for example, a Jewess used to abuse the prophet and disparage him. A man strangled her till she died. The apostle of Allah declared that no recompense was payable for her blood. The scholarly Muslim translation of this hadith informs us Jews or any non-Muslim who insults Islam's prophet should also be killed per all the major schools of Islamic law. Apropos to our discussion, the Khomeini-era Iranian regime, dating back to its seizure of power before the 1989 Salman Rushdie affair, has spearheaded this Islamic assault on freedom of speech via nonviolent attempts to alter human rights instruments and murderous violence. Iran's ongoing global campaign to enact and enforce traditional Sharia Islamic law per blasphemy reveals an essential aspect of its worldview, a totalitarian Sharia-compliant vision for humanity. The directed murderous assault on Parisian Jews is also consistent with Iran's own Islamic Jew hatred. Islamic jihadism and Jew hatred, a Shiite Iranian legacy not of the last 35 years, but the last 500 in turn, explain Iran's relentless pursuit of nuclear weapons for the express purposes of destroying the Jewish state of Israel and defeating the U.S. so the Islamic Republic can fulfill its hegemonic aspirations. Next slide, please. So, very briefly, there are three motivational pillars in terms of this relentless pursuit of nuclear weapons and regional and then more global hegemony. And that's jihad, which is a permanent institution of conquering warfare. It's enshrined literally in the Iranian constitution. Najis, which is something we can maybe talk about later, it's a really odious doctrine of the physical and spiritual impurity of the infidel. It's a doctrine that was espoused dating back to the founding of the Iranian Shiite theocracy at the beginning of the 16th century. It's been totally revitalized under the current regime after a hiatus which turned out to be relatively brief during the Pahlavi period from 1925 to 1979. And of course, canonical Islamic Jew hatred. This comes, unfortunately, from Islam's core texts, the Quran, the Hadith, and the earliest Muslim biographies of Muhammad. And I also think that we have some misconceptions that need to be clarified. Iran, since 1979, next slide please, is intimately connected to the Iran of the Safavid Qajar theocratic Shiite dynasties. So from 1501 to 1925, there was a period during the 18th century where there was a lot of turmoil in Iran, but basically it covers this entire period. So the hiatus was 1925 to 1979, when there was a period of westernization and secularization. But if we look at an appropriate summary of the Weltanschauung, of the worldview in that period from 1501 to 1925, a very Persianophilic scholar, Brown, wrote in 1906, the Mujtahids, these are very learned Muslim scholars, and the mullah, more local level preachers, are a great force in Persia and concern themselves with every department of human activity, from the minutest detail of personal purification to the largest issues of politics. That's no different than what we're seeing today. Iran's current attitudes toward Israel mirror its treatment of Iranian Jewry during the Safavid Qajar eras. It was a very, very brutally oppressive administration of the Sharia, rife with all kinds of virulent anti-Semitism. Areas of Iran, I had never seen this word outside of a European context, were literally rendered Judenrein in periodic pogroms that took place throughout this entire period. And that was in the face of what was really a very tiny Jewish population, never more than 0.4% of the entire population of Iran. And unfortunately, the Green Movement ideologues and politicians share the Ayatollah Khamenei worldviews. I will give you an example of that if we have time. Overwhelming popular support for a Sharia state persists in Iran, and a nuclear program remains very popular as per polling data. We can skip the next few slides. Basically, what I wanted to allude to was the fact, you can skip that if we look at the regime's own ideologues. So, for example, of course, Khomeini himself. That one. just to give you pause, if we compare Khomeini to Ayatollah Montazeri, who's felt to be the Green Movement spiritual leader, we see really no difference in terms of their attitudes about jihadism, and it's based on the prototype of Muhammad, who was a conqueror. And I think this is also very important to realize going forward. Next slide, please. The evolution of jihad doctrine, again, took place centuries ago. It's been revitalized. But all the principles that we see currently enshrined in the Iranian regime can be vividly illustrated if one studies the period of these two dynasties, of these two Shiite, Twelver, theocratic dynasties. And again, to cut to the chase, if we look at the jurist Al-Amili, who died in 1622, he simply says, jihad against followers of other religions, such as Jews, is required unless they convert to Islam or pay the poll tax. Next slide. Very briefly, Majlisi was the Ayatollah Khomeini of his era. He wrote this book, which sounds lovely. It's called Oceans of Light. However, in it, he clarifies the two aspects of the non-Muslims' najis, or impurity. The first is their spiritual impurity, which he says is caused by their essential nastiness and the corruption of their beliefs. And the second flows logically from it, and it has to do with their literal physical impurity. So their bodily secretions, not to be too gross about it, everything about them. And what we see is that this would engender very dehumanizing behaviors. Jews, Zoroastrians, Christians could literally be beaten, sometimes severely, sometimes to death, for going out in the rain, because the fear was that their impurity could wash off them. Now, we see accounts of this certainly from the Jewish population through the 1920s. Next slide, please. You can see these abhorrent listings of all the measures that were imposed upon the Jews repeatedly, as expressed again by Al-Amili in a manual of Islamic law from the 17th century. Then we can see the effects of these jurisdictions on the Jews by travelers that passed through Iran well into the 19th century. And I'll just really, as a summary, give you the observations of Claude Honnête, who actually was an interesting fellow. That was his writing name. He was actually Jean Chauffer, and he was a tennis player who reached two singles finals at the Amateur French Championships. He won in 1892 and he lost in 1893. He also published a travelogue called Through Persia in a Motor Car, and it recounts his firsthand observations from 1905, and he's talking specifically about the plight of Iran's Jews. He says, living in the midst of a fanatical and hostile population, Jews in Persia are reduced to the last extremity of degradation. Nearly all trades are forbidden to them. Everything they touch, again, this najis idea, is considered defiled. There is very little justice in Persia for anybody. For the Jews, there is none at all. Every possible exaction is practiced on them. Nobody takes their part, and they live in appalling poverty, while their moral and physical degradation is beyond description. Next slide, please. Again, just to show you that without reading through the entire quotes, the Green Movement, spiritual godfather, Ayatollah Montazeri's views, the jihad as articulated in the Iranian constitution are identical. It's very dubious prospect at best that you would get a significant change in ideology if and when the Green Movement ever came to power. Next slide, please. An Iranian moderate was interviewed within about 3 weeks of the original P5+1 agreement. So the agreement between the original members of the UN Security Council plus Germany and the party being negotiated with, of course, Iran. And he described what had happened back on November 24th of 2013 as being the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, which will be followed by a conquest of Mecca. So he was referring to the fact that he felt that this agreement would only be to Iran's benefit, and it is a point of Islamic law that the Muslims will not make a treaty unless they're in a weaker position, so that they can strengthen themselves. And it goes back to how Muhammad dealt with the Quraysh tribe of Mecca, and then he goes on to threaten the United States, or feel that the United States itself could be threatened. And we just heard from Ambassador Ettinger and also from Congressman Franks about how that's a realistic possibility. It's not as far-fetched as it sounded. And, of course, the sentiments to immediately annihilate Israel. Next slide, please. All I wanted to point out in this slide is that the Najis doctrine has been reinvigorated in Iran. It is Ayatollah Montazeri, unfortunately, again, the Green Movement spiritual godfather, is a strong proponent, or was a strong proponent of it. He passed away in 2009. One quick anecdote. The Armenian Christian minority in Iran suffers from this as well. When Khomeini came to power, an Armenian family which had run a Coca-Cola bottling plant fled, and they were invited back to run their factory for the benefit of the country, only under the conditions that none of the Armenian workers would be allowed to touch the product. This is very, very odious stuff, and it has unfortunately been revitalized. Next slide, please. Here it is in action from Montazeri himself. A Persian friend sent this to me. This is Ayatollah Montazeri refusing to shake the hand of a Najis Jew, as the Farsi caption tells us, because it would make him impure as he's about to engage in his prayers. Next slide, please. Just to let you know that the Shiite luminary Allama Tabatabai, he is how do we describe this? The leading clerical inspiration for Shi'ism itself, for Twelver Shi'ism itself in the 20th century. The greatest Quranic commentator amongst the Shia, a philosopher extolled by Jane Damon McAuliffe, who was former president of Bryn Mawr and publishes the Journal of Quranic Studies, a true luminary. And unfortunately, his attitudes reflect the doctrine, the Shiite doctrine of Jew hatred, which pervades Iran. He says, commenting on a specific Quranic verse, Quran 582, which is often a pivotal verse in terms of the anti-Semitism in the Quran, and it's about how the Jews, in a transference mechanism, harbor the greatest hatred towards the Muslims, and therefore, of course, that validates hatred of them. So, in commenting on this verse, in his gloss from the Quranic commentary, I'll just leave you with this. He says, the Jews, although they had the same alternatives as the Christians, and they could retain their religion with payment of the jizya, the Quranic poll tax, yet they continued in their haughtiness, became harder in their bigotry, and turned to double dealing and deception. They broke their covenants, eagerly waited calamities to befall the Muslims, and dealt to them the bitterest deal. The enmity of the Jews toward the divine religion, Islam, and their sustained arrogance and bigotry have continued exactly in the same manner even after the Prophet Muhammad. These unchanged characteristics confirm what the mighty book, the Quran, had indicated. And so there's a centrality of Jew hatred in this doctrine. It is why there's this obsessive impulse to destroy Israel. It's something that we need to come to terms with. Yes, there's this theology also about end of times, and frankly, the Sunni doctrine is far more virulent towards the Jews. Actually, the Sunnis are replaced the Sunnis replace the Jews in Shiite end of times theology, although there's some cross-pollination these days. And again, we're seeing these endless calls of annihilation of Israel straight across the line, from Khomeini right through Rouhani, different kinds of metaphors, but they're always very, very destructive metaphors. And as the previous speakers have pointed out, this is just the first step on a global jihad. Thank you very much.
Thank you. In case you've just joined us on this live stream, I'm Frank Gaffney with the Center for Security Policy. We're sponsoring this Truth Squad. You've just heard from Dr. Andrew Bostom, the author, among other things, of Iran's Final Solution for Israel. An important takeaway, of course, from his remarks, those of Congressman Franks and Ambassador Ettinger, is it's not just Israel that is considered to be impure. It is all of us infidels. And this is at the heart of the regime that we're dealing with at the moment on this negotiation on the bomb. You wouldn't know that from the representations, the characterizations, the discussions that are taking place in official Washington on this idea of negotiating a deal with the Iranians. Next up, I'm very pleased to say, one of my colleagues at the Center for Security Policy, Claire Lopez, a former career clandestine officer in the Central Intelligence Agency. She has, over the years since she left government work, become truly one of the foremost experts in Washington on not only the nature of this regime, but the character of its conduct. I've asked her to focus principally on the non-nuclear elements of that conduct because, again, we're interested in providing context here for an evaluation of the truth about this regime and the reliability of any deal that might be struck with it on the negotiating front with respect to nuclear weapons. Claire Lopez, thank you very much. She is our Senior Vice President for Research and Analysis at the Center these days. We're delighted to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Frank. Thanks for all of you being here today to participate in this presentation about Iran. Building on what Ambassador Ettinger spoke of and the global really strategy of Iran, as well as the framework that Dr. Bostom just placed this in, which is a Dar al-Harb versus Dar al-Islam. It is a Jew hatred as well as a counter-infidel ideology. I want to talk about some of the more recent moves by Iran on what we would call the global jihad chessboard. And this to frame what is going on as well, and you'll hear after me from my colleague Fred Fleitz about the actual nuclear weapons negotiations talks. So everything in here, open source, of course. So the nuclear talks and Iran's drive to achieve deliverable nuclear weapons capability really is for the purpose not just to have nukes, although that's an end goal in and of itself, but rather to further its broader revolutionary goals. Iran's leadership, as Andy just talked about, very much still focused on the revolutionary objectives that drove the 1979 revolution. And so I want to mention a couple of articles that are on the table up here in front. The first one is by Omri Cheren, whom I'm quoting in this slide here, another one by Andy Bostom, and finally my 2009 paper that the Center graciously published about the Iran lobby. So I will be citing to some of those as we talk here. But Omri Cheren published a really interesting piece not very long ago, just a couple of weeks ago, and he was addressing the nuclear talks as Andy described between the P5+1 parties, of course Iran, the IAEA is also a party to that. And he says that the Obama administration is promoting, really implementing, a policy of deception and delusion with those talks. The joint plan of action upon which those talks are based was signed in November 2013, but right there in the prologue to negotiations, really, that plan of action gave Iran just about everything that it already wanted. The right to enrich, the right to keep all of its enriched uranium, albeit some of that has to be diluted down and changed to some other forms. It gets to continue its centrifuge R&D. It gets to continue building at least elements for installation ultimately at the Arak plant, which is its plutonium heavy water reactor site. And it's going to get to continue working on its intercontinental ballistic missile capability, which is the delivery system for nuclear weapons. Terror support completely unaddressed in these talks, and of course the sanctions that formerly had brought many in the international community together. That sanctions regime is busted. I mean, essentially it is ended, and I don't see how it can be put back together again, despite moves in Congress by members such as Senator Menendez or Representative Kirk, who would like to reimpose sanctions if Iran reneges on the agreement or does not continue with the talks. In any case, I will quote, and this is in Andy Bostom's article on the front table here, the diplomatic processes they are aggressively pursuing, that is, the Obama administration is pursuing, inevitably will yield an Iran armed with nuclear weapons. Now, what does that mean in terms of its other global objectives? Well, let's look at some of that. You've got to think in terms like Spock. And remember in Star Trek, he had that three-dimensional chess set and he used to play. Okay, that's how you have to think about the way the Iranians are moving. When I refer to a chessboard, this is kind of how complicated it really is and how sophisticated they are at it. So yes, the Iranians are pursuing nuclear weapons. They do that through various means, and they pursue their objectives overall through these various means, through terrorist proxies, through cyber warfare. These things are tools in the end. Any of its WMD capabilities, the terrorism, and the cyber warfare, among other things, those are just tools to achieve its goals, its ideological objectives, again, going back to the 1979 revolution. And by the way, as Andy mentioned, encoded in the Iranian Constitution, available in English on the internet. So what does that regime seek? It's a jihadist regime. The Constitution says so. It seeks to enforce the revolution at home and export it abroad. That's number one. Number two, it seeks geostrategic domination of the Persian Gulf region and even beyond. And finally, it looks for to claim global leadership of the global jihad movement away from the Sunnis, with which it has been engaged in a struggle ever since the reported, at least to us, death of Muhammad in 632. And finally, the destruction of Israel, the U.S., and the Western system more generally is necessary in their minds for the achievement of these other goals. So right now, the Shia and the Persians, the Iranians, are on a tear, as I would say. This is an intra-Islamic sectarian struggle we see going on in the Middle East, certainly in Iraq, or what used to be called Iraq, what used to be called Syria, where Iran and the Shiite forces, its proxies included, meaning Hezbollah, but also Alawites, which are kind of an offshoot of Shiites in Syria, facing off against the primary representative of Sunni Islam, that is Saudi Arabia. And this is an ongoing 1,300-year battle that is surging up once again to claim dominance of the global jihad. At this moment, amidst all of this chaos in the Middle East, both the Sunni and the Shia see themselves at least as having a chance at winning, if not uppermost. The outcome is really uncertain how things are going to go over there. But if and when Iran achieves deliverable nuclear weapons, that's game over. And that is why the achievement of deliverable nuclear weapons for this regime is a sine qua non. In other words, they gotta get it. They'll do anything to get it. Next, please. So their geostrategic policy, their geopolitical strategy in the world is to advance that agenda via proxies at the tactical level, to defend puppet regimes like the one in Baghdad, like the one in Damascus, project its terrorist reach, again, using proxies like Hezbollah, also Hamas, and it's working for them, or at least they perceive it that way right now. And they will also commit, and have committed, the IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, its Quds Force, and the MOIS, that's its intelligence service, Ministry of Intelligence and Security, to places like Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and yes, the Western Hemisphere, also Western Europe. On a strategic parallel track, even as all of the rest of this is going on, keep in mind, as Fred will discuss with us more in detail, the nuclear negotiations track en route to a bomb. So that chessboard that I'm talking about, look at a map here of that Middle East I think the Iranians' intention is to surround both Saudi Arabia, its nemesis for leadership of the global jihad, and of course Israel. Israel has got, of course, Hezbollah, terror proxy to the north, Hamas, terror proxy to the south. But now look at the broader picture. You've got the Iranians boasting at this point in time that they now control 4 Arab capitals: Tripoli, Lebanon, Damascus, Syria, Baghdad, Iraq, and Sana'a in Yemen, plus Tehran, of course. Now look at how that dominance of that geography surrounds Saudi Arabia. What's the prize? The prize are the Saudi oil fields and Mecca and Medina. That's the prize. Israel too. But in this broader sense, and some of the moves we're seeing more recently, I think they're going for Saudi Arabia. All right, just recently, as I've just mentioned, another domino has fallen to the Shiite column, the Iranian column, and that is, of course, in Yemen. Just this month, earlier, Houthi rebels backed by Iran and Hezbollah seized control of the capital in Sana'a. The U.S., by the way, has an intelligence sharing arrangement with the Houthis. That was an admission in front of a congressional presentation by a senior member of the intelligence community. At the same time that it has also been admitted by senior intelligence officials that our counterterrorism operations in Yemen are paralyzed. Now in Yemen, you've got the Islamic State also present recently. That's a recent development. The Islamic State is present in Yemen. It's battling against AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Well, so are we. A U.S. nemesis, obviously. That means that in Yemen, at least, right now, I don't know what time is it, almost 2:30, the U.S., Iran, Hezbollah, and the Islamic State are all on the same side of things. Sort of, kind of. Next slide, please. All right, what is it that Iran is driving towards in terms of delivery capability? Let's look at this satellite photo imagery from just a couple of weeks ago. This comes to us by way of the Israelis, and it is a satellite image of a new Iranian ICBM sitting on a launch pad outside of Tehran. It's 89 feet tall. It is definitely intercontinental in reach. That means this one, at least, they've got others, but this one is not aimed at Israel. This is aimed much farther away than Israel. Now, you'll remember that within the last couple of years, 2012, 2013, the Pentagon issued open source reporting that by 2015, that's where we are right now, Iran would have the capability to reach the United States, continental United States, with an ICBM from Iran. Well, folks, there it is. That missile can carry conventional or non-conventional, meaning nuclear, warheads, and its range, as I said, can reach U.S. and Europe. Now, to defend those missiles, that one and others that Iran's got in its arsenal, the Iranians have for a long time been trying to acquire a Russian air defense system called the S-300. Well, just recently, within the past week, the Russian defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, visited Tehran. You can see him here shaking hands with the Iranian defense minister to sign a defense agreement. And it is thought that the provision of the S-300, or perhaps even its more recent upgrade, more sophisticated version, the S-400, possibly could be part of that deal. Let me turn to the cyber world. Iran very much is involved in cyber warfare. This is a private company called Cylance in late 2014 came out with a report. This is the cover of the report. It's online. You can find it under Cylance. It's called Operation Cleaver. Operation Cleaver is the name given to an Iranian extensive cyber warfare operation that has already achieved penetration of 16 countries' critical infrastructure. I'm talking electric, oil, gas, water, and etc. Those countries of the 16 include the United States, Canada, Australia, Israel, and others. They've already got that capability. Next. Israel is not standing still. This is the pushback we are seeing last Sunday, about a week ago. The Israelis conducted a strike against a convoy of cars up on the Golan Heights. There's a map there. You can see that little sliver there that is the Golan Heights between Israel and Syria, and in the strike killed a number of Hezbollah operatives and also two very senior IRGC officers, one of them General Muhammad Ali Al-Dadi, and also a field commander by the name of Abu Ali Tabtabi, both killed. Also, the son of Imad Mughniya, whose name was Jihad Mughniya, young 20-something, was also killed in that strike. Next. The father, as you can see the middle photo up at the top there, that is the father, that's Imad Mughniya, responsible for the Buenos Aires Cultural Center, Jewish Cultural Center bombings of 1994. He, the father, was killed in 2008 in an assassination car bombing in Damascus. Over there to the left, that is the son, Jihad, as a teen, speaking at his father's funeral. Down at the bottom left, that is the commander of the Quds Force, the white-haired officer, that is Qasem Soleimani, and together with his protege, the young Jihad Mughniya. And then over on the right, Mughniya together with the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. Next. So what was Iran doing up there on the Golan Heights? Well, the Israelis suspect that they possibly were up there getting ready or surveying sites from which to set up a missile base that would be able to strike northern Israel down into the Galilee. By striking against these officers, Hezbollah and the Iranians, Israel shows that it's going to maintain its deterrence. It lays down a line and says the Golan is off limits. And the presence, of course, of those senior officials up there indicates that they were trying to change what has heretofore been the status quo, at least since 2006, the war between Israel and Hezbollah. They were trying to change that status quo with what they were doing up there. Now, I would say that as things are heating up, and we see today that there have been strikes and counterstrikes between Israel and Hezbollah up on the Golan Heights or in that area, and two Israeli troops at least are reported killed. Neither Hezbollah nor Iran really wants to get into a shooting serious war with Israel right now because they're both overstretched with their support to the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Retaliation is expected. As I said, some of it may have already just begun today. But Lebanon has said they will not be the launching site, don't want to be the launching site for that retaliation. So what that means is that the retaliation can come from other places, including the Western Hemisphere. Iran and Hezbollah have extensive networks in South, Central, and North America. I'm going to refer back again to the 1994 AMIA, that's the Jewish Cultural Center bombings in Buenos Aires, where the investigation done by an intrepid prosecutor continues, or at least we hope that it will continue, because, as we now know, Alberto Nisman, Argentinian prosecutor, was assassinated in Buenos Aires about a week ago in his apartment, shot with a single shot to the head. He had been ready to present to the Argentinian Congress evidence of the Argentinian government cover-up of that investigation into the AMIA bombing those many years ago. Unfortunately, our own administration, as it turns out, is reported to have pressured Argentina to back off of that investigation. What it looks like is that Argentina wanted to patch things up with Iran in order to secure a favorable trade deal whereby they would trade food for Iranian oil at concessionary prices. Here is Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chairman Bob Menendez speaking very recently in Congress, and he says, the more I hear from the administration, it's quotes, the more it sounds like talking points straight out of Tehran. Well, what was he talking about with that? He was talking about the testimony of this Deputy Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, who testified on 19 January before Congress, the Foreign Relations Committee of Senator Bob Menendez, and he admitted in questioning that the White House is no longer negotiating to stop Iran from a breakout capability to nuclear weapons, but only to get a better alarm signal ahead of time if Iran tries to make a breakout for nuclear weapons capability. This is the back and forth. Look, I'll let you look quickly at the highlighted portions of those quotes between Senator Menendez and Blinken, and he admits pretty much straight up, they're not trying to stop an Iranian breakout anymore with the negotiations process. I wanted to bring this book to your attention because I think this book, The Devil We Know, written by Bob Baer, in 2009 it was published, is the blueprint for what we're seeing right now out of the Obama administration. The negotiations, the capitulations, the willingness to allow Iran to become the hegemonic power of the Persian Gulf region. This book, very briefly, urges the United States to accept Iran as the regional hegemon. It urges the U.S. to accept Iranian designs on the Saudi oil fields. I kid you not, that's what he says in here, as well as designs on Mecca and Medina. And no problem, according to him, with an Iranian nuclear capability. I read this book back in 2009. You could see I tabbed it all up. I stuck it on a bookshelf, and I said, this is bonkers. Maybe not. It looks to me now like this book might be the blueprint of what the administration is doing. How did we get this far? How did we get to the point where an American administration is capitulating on this level and acquiescing to an Iranian-dominated Middle East? Well, I think it goes back to the paper that's on the table here, my 2009 Rise of the Iran Lobby paper, which describes the influence operations of a number of groups operating in the Capitol, on Capitol Hill, as lobbyists and as influence operators to change opinion and ultimately to change U.S. policy on the Middle East and Iran. This is the president and founder, Trita Parsi, of the organization called NIAC, National Iranian American Council. The messaging consistently coming out of him and this organization, Rouhani, President Hassan Rouhani of Iran, he's all about moderation, he's for peace. Give him some more accommodations, give him what he's asking for in negotiations, and all will be well. Well, these are some of the folks involved in NIAC. On the advisory board, you can see some of the funders here as well. Next, please. Lastly, I want to bring out to your attention this book called A Time to Attack. It's recently published by Matthew Kronig, who is a professor at Georgetown University. He also is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And in this book, he outlines and works through all the options for dealing with Iran. The diplomacy, the negotiations, sanctions, and finally containment or deterrence if and when Iran achieves a nuclear weapons capability. However, he comes to the conclusion, not quite as definitively stated in this book, but as recounted later, and this quote at the bottom there is from him after the publication of the book, as a last resort, an Israeli strike, because he knows the Obama administration is not going to do this, and the year or two of breathing space at a minimum that would buy would be preferable to acquiescing to a nuclear Iran. Last slide. This is, of course, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, invited now to address the U.S. Congress in early March this year. And he takes very seriously, as he says here, his obligation to make every effort to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weaponry that will be aimed at the State of Israel. We can hope only that he means to keep that word and look forward to his visit. Thank you very much.
Claire, thank you. It pains me to cut anybody off because there's so much material here that really does need to be brought together. We've had a sense of the strategic stakes from Congressman Trent Franks. We've had a sense of the perspective from Israel on what is truly a key front in what I think of as the war for the free world, namely the danger that this Iranian regime represents to America as well as other freedom-loving people, including the Israelis. Andrew Bostom, of course, with a spectacularly important assessment of the, well, if you will, the political DNA of this government in Tehran and what makes it seek nuclear weapons and engage in the kinds of activities that Claire has just brilliantly illuminated well beyond the nuclear piece. But now we get finally to that nuclear piece with another of our colleagues, I'm very pleased to say, at the Center for Security Policy, our senior fellow Fred Fleitz, like Claire, a man who has spent much of his professional life in the Central Intelligence Agency, in his case as an analyst. He also worked for then Undersecretary of State John Bolton as his chief of staff at the State Department, and as a professional staff member up here in the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. Fred has been tirelessly tracking the negotiations and the state of the unraveling U.S. position, and consequently that of the rest of the Perm 5 as well, and the extent to which we are now, contrary to the representations of the Obama administration, looking at an incipient nuclear capability on the part of the Iranians. How far out and with what effect, we hope Fred will share some further light on. Fred Fleitz, thank you for joining us.
In his State of the Union address on January 22nd, President Obama said, "Our diplomacy is at work with respect to Iran, where for the first time in a decade, we've halted the progress of its nuclear program and reduced its nuclear stockpile." I worked on this issue for the CIA, the State Department, the House Intelligence Committee, and for the Center. And I can tell you that this statement isn't even close to being true. And I responded by writing an article for National Review Online entitled, "Obama Straight Up Lied About Iran's Nukes Tonight. Their Progress Hasn't Been Halted." And this piece included this chart here. And it illustrates that far from freezing Iran's nuclear program, far from stopping Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons, Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium has skyrocketed since 2009. The number of weapons Iran can make out of its enriched uranium has grown from 0 when the president entered office to at least 8 today. Now, let me explain to you how we came to these conclusions. Iran has stopped enriching uranium to the 20% uranium-235 level, and the administration has said that's a great achievement. It isn't. Iran is still enriching uranium to the reactor grade. It only takes 2 weeks longer to make weapons-grade uranium from reactor-grade uranium than if you start with 20% enriched uranium. Now, this chart shows the surge in reactor-grade uranium. The red line is what we're counting on available low-enriched uranium at the reactor grade that the Iranians could make weapons out of. Iran could make a weapon out of its enriched uranium at the reactor grade in 2.2 to 3.5 months right now. Now, there's an interesting thing about this chart. I ran this on National Review, got a lot of response for it, but the next day something unusual happened, something I don't think has ever happened for the Center for Security Policy. The Washington Post fact checker column used our chart to fact check the president. And I have a copy of this piece at the back. It's by Glenn Kessler, and the title is "Obama's Claim That Iran's Nuclear Program Has Been Halted and Its Nuclear Stockpile Reduced." Well, Mr. Kessler awarded the president 3 out of 5 Pinocchios for making inaccurate statements about the Iranian nuclear program. And he included our chart, which I said was sort of stunning for the Center for Security Policy. But there's a twist on this that's interesting. Mr. Kessler, who I've worked in the past, he's a good journalist, consulted with 2 arms control experts, and they grudgingly said our chart was basically right, but they thought it had some technical differences. One of the people with whom Mr. Kessler consulted was a guy named Ali Hanonen. Hanonen is a former IAEA nuclear inspector. He's now teaching at the Harvard JFK School, and I consulted with him on this chart. Mr. Hanonen looked at the data and he said, well, it seems to be right, but frankly, Iran could make more weapons. And he noted, see the blue line there is the total amount of uranium enriched. We only use the red numbers for LU available. But according to Mr. Hanonen, Iran has the capability of converting total uranium enriched that may have been converted into other forms into uranium hexafluoride, which could be further enriched into weapons-grade uranium fairly quickly. Basically, Hanonen said our figures were on the low side. We said 8 nuclear weapons right now. Hanonen, who worked for the IAEA, told the Washington Post Iran could make more than 8 weapons right now with its enriched uranium stockpile enriched at the reactor grade level. Now, I used figures on the low side because I didn't want the center to be accused of pushing the envelope or exaggerating this threat. But I'm just saying that when Hanonen, someone who is a pretty credible expert on this, says basically he's confirmed the validity of our data. So I think this is pretty remarkable. It also confirms, frankly, what the President is saying about the nuclear talks and Iran's nuclear program simply aren't true. As Claire said, the talks have conceded to Iran the right to enrich uranium. We're not going to force Iran to stop enriching, to give up uranium centrifuges, to give up its stockpile of enriched uranium, to stop building the Iraq heavy water reactor, which will be a source of plutonium. During the nuclear talks, Iran has not cooperated with the IAEA. There are still facilities it will not let the IAEA into. According to the administration, there must be robust IAEA efforts to confirm this deal, to verify it, for it to work. Well, if Iran isn't allowing that during the talks, how can we expect Iran to cooperate with an agreement after it's signed? There's a facility right now called Parchin, where Iran supposedly has done explosive testing to develop nuclear warheads. Not only will Iran not let the IAEA inspectors go there, it is involved in a cover-up to hide evidence. It's changed the soil, it's painted and washed down buildings to hide evidence of efforts it's made to develop nuclear warheads, explosive testing at this facility. So what does this add up to? We have talks where we've made enormous concessions. We're allowing Iran in talks to have more and more centrifuges. There's all these aspects of the program we're not allowing them to stop. Well, in my view, and I want to concur with what Claire said, but in a different way. This administration has no intention of stopping Iran's pursuit of a nuclear weapon. I believe they're siding with experts from the Brookings Foundation, from Columbia University and Georgetown University in saying we can live with a nuclear Iran. The purpose of these talks is not to stop Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons, it is to contain it. The President has decided to give Iran the bomb, to acknowledge Iran the bomb, because he wants a deal so desperately, in the belief that Iran's going to get it anyway, and the United States will just have to contain it. But since we're not making any significant steps to force Iran to cooperate with verification measures, this is an extremely dangerous approach. The Center has been urging Congress to insist that these talks be stopped. These talks, the nuclear talks, are fatally flawed. They're not going to be salvaged with sanctions. They're not going to be salvaged with more diplomatic pressure on the Iranians. They have to be stopped. They're fatally flawed. We've conceded far too much. I was disappointed recently when 10 senators said that they're going to give the President until the end of March before they push more sanctions against Iran. But I have to say I'm a little bit hopeful that maybe we will actually have a veto-proof majority by the end of March to place tough sanctions on Iran, to insist that it comply with all existing UN Security Council resolutions. This may force Iran to withdraw from the talks. Good. A bad deal is going to be much worse than no deal here. The only responsible approach for the United States is to stop these nuclear talks, go back to the drawing board with our Western allies, and start over again. We've simply conceded too much. We've set up a situation where Iran will have the capability of producing multiple nuclear weapons worth of enriched uranium per year based on what has already been agreed to in the talks that is known. And I'm talking about concessions that we've heard about of allowing Iran to operate up to 8,000 nuclear centrifuges. So there's some significant steps that had to be taken by Congress right now. I wish Congress would say tomorrow, we're going to pass sanctions against Iran immediately until it complies with all relevant UN Security Council resolutions. But I'm gratified with articles like the one with the Washington Post, what we're hearing from Senator Menendez, what we're hearing from Senator Kirk, that there is a growing bipartisan movement in Congress to say enough. These talks are going to hurt our interests. They're going to cause international instability. We have to start over again. So I urge Congress to take such steps, and welcome your questions. Thank you.
Let me just add one point on this. What Fred has shown in these charts, of course, is the known Iranian program, the declared Iranian program, the program that has, to varying degrees, been monitored by the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, up until the point where the Iranians stopped cooperating with them, which is another sort of sanity check we ought to be engaged in here when before they finish these negotiations, they're already stiffing the group that is supposedly going to monitor their compliance going forward. That's not a good sign, to say the least. Claire has mentioned Matt Kroenig's book, Time to Strike. I just want to take advantage of the presence here today of a man that I've come to admire greatly over the years. He happens to chair the Center's Military Committee. He's actually a man who has planned and almost got to execute a strike on Iran, back at a time when it might have made all the difference in not only the trajectory of these nuclear ambitions, but of this regime itself. And had it been executed, perhaps spared our nation and the world the blight that Claire has touched upon in the few minutes she had just now. His name is Admiral James A. Ace Lyons. Admiral Lyons formerly served, among other many distinguished positions he held, as the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. He has a story to tell, and I hope he will tell it briefly, sir, if you would. But I wanted also to just say Admiral Lyons and Fred and Claire and a number of others of us, including Jim Hansen, who's here in the room, participated in a project recently which I would commend to all of you if you are interested in learning more about not only this part of the global jihad movement, but the entire enterprise and what the United States can do about it. We call it a plan for victory over the global jihad movement. It was put together by a kind of pickup tiger team, if you will, and published about 2 weeks ago. It is available on our website, securefreedom.org, and really required reading for those of us who are concerned about this threat, but no longer willing to put up with what are frankly lies about its character and disinformation or inaction at the very least about what to do about it. So with that, let me introduce briefly, sir, again, if you would, the closing cleanup batter, Admiral Ace Lyons. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you all for coming. You know, there's an old adage, you don't negotiate with evil. And there's no question the Khomeini regime is not only evil, they're corrupt. And as has been pointed out, what would an agreement with such a regime mean anyway? The Islamic principle of taqiyya, lying, to advance the cause of Islam, will certainly come into play. You know, with Iran, there have been thousands of Americans who have lost their lives, starting with the takeover of our embassy in Tehran in 1979. The Marine barracks blow up, our embassy blow up, and all the other kidnappings, the murder of our CIA station chief. But most importantly, never forget the role that Iran played in providing the necessary material and training support to the 9/11 hijackers, without which that attack could not have been carried out. That seems to get dismissed. And let me tell you, as Frank mentioned, and I will be brief, I promise. Ever since, it hasn't mattered whether it's been a Republican or Democratic regime. Every one of them has failed to find the political courage to take the action that had to be taken. Starting with Carter when they took over our embassy. The chairman called me up. I was the director of political and military affairs for the JCS then. And he said, "What can we do?" I said, "I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to take Carg Island." We could have walked in, taken it with Navy SEALs, and we would have cut Comey off at the knees. My plan was you got 24 hours to turn over the embassy, or you're going to have the biggest ashtray in the Middle East. The next time came with the Marine barracks blow-up. Casey called me out to Langley. I was the deputy chief of naval operations then. And he said, if we find out who did it, would I make up the plans to take them out? I said, of course. Long story short, he said, there's one stipulation. Whatever we give you, you can't turn over to the Joint Staff. He didn't want to read about it in the next edition of the Washington Post, and which I agreed to, and I never did turn it over, even though I'm down briefing the chairman. He said, I want you to turn all that. I said, I'm very sorry, I can't do it, and didn't do it. I knew then the Soviets were reading our communications. This is long before we knew about John Walker. I won't go in to tell you how I knew that, but I did. So I couried the plans to the carriers. We had the planes loaded. We were ready to launch. We were going to make the Sheikh Abdullah barracks look like a plowed cornfield in Iowa. We'd have wiped out the entire core group of Hezbollah. The guy that sabotaged the strike, and this is after I personally briefed him in his office, was none other than the Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger. He did it not only once, but twice. Reagan approved a combined strike with the French, and Weinberger wouldn't issue the order. I personally talked to George Shultz, Bud McFarlane on this, and they verify it. They made calls, and he refused to change his position. Who got to him? God knows. But he certainly was gotten to. The next time was in the Gulf Tanker War. We had the plans to shut Iran down. We'd been working on it for a number of months. Again, I briefed Weinberger at my headquarters at Pearl Harbor. And we could have really brought down the Khomeini regime. We had multiple opportunities to change the course of history, and we failed each one of them. Here we are today. Now, I got to tell you, economic sanctions to me have always been a cop-out. There's only one way to stop the Iranian nuclear program. You gotta take it out physically. Now, with this administration, that's not going to happen. As I said in a recent op-ed piece, it's up to Israel, regretfully. And we need to provide them with the necessary resources to make it as successful as possible. Of course, what's going on, and you recognize this, treasonous acts are being committed. The takedown of our military capability is unheard of. Yet we don't have the leadership in this building to stand up and do anything about it. If they had the political backbone and courage, really, impeachment proceedings would be started. And never mind the crap about falling back, but look what happened to Clinton. Clinton's was a sex and lying to a jury. This is not even in the same ballpark. This is our national security. This isn't anything we should be screwing around with. Will it happen? Regretfully, I'm not optimistic. But let me say this, we can't give up. And we have to do everything we can in our power to keep the pressure on. Thanks very much.
Well, this is a remarkable group of authorities on matters that have really spanned the universe of untruths to which we all have been exposed. I'm very grateful to them all for joining us. I just want to tease one thing that is coming up next. This is part of, as I indicated earlier in our paper, and I forgot to mention the actual title of it, we're calling it the Secure Freedom Strategy. This is part of the global jihad. It is not the entirety of it by any means. We have to address it in its larger complexion as well as in this particular matter. On the 11th of February, the Center will be sponsoring a program here in Washington that will be a sort of corrective to the summit that the President has announced he will be convening on the 18th of February. He's calling his the Countering Violent Extremism Summit. We're calling ours the Defeat Jihad Summit. And hopefully the distinction will be made even more clear. We understand we will have the pleasure of, among other eminences, contributions from Governor Bobby Jindal, former Speaker Newt Gingrich, Senator Ted Cruz, Geert Wilders from the Netherlands, and quite a cast of characters who I think both understand the true character of this jihadist enterprise, recognize the inadequacies of the program that we've been following, as the Admiral has said, under administrations of both Republican and Democratic coloration, and have some ideas, including this one, about what to do about it. The advantage of this one, if I may say, is that it is rooted in the strategy that President Reagan adopted. Didn't get that strike on Iran right, but he sure got the program on the Soviet Union, the last totalitarian ideology that sought our destruction. And we've updated this strategy. He called it National Security Decision Directive 75 to apply it to the present, some have called it communism with a god, the totalitarian ideology of Sharia. We invite you to join us for this conversation. It will also be live streamed, and I think it will be a real contribution, again, as we hope this Truth Squad has been to our understanding of where the truth lies and what we need to adopt a program based upon it, not the delusions, not the lies. With that, we're delighted to take any questions you may have. If you would identify to whom you would like to address them, and we may have to ask the Admiral to return up here if you would, sir, in case any might be going your way, but we'd be delighted to have you join us again. Any questions for our speakers? If not, let me just offer one. Yes, please. Identify yourself if you would, please.
Sure. Dan Pollock from the Zionist Organization of America. I totally agree with the analysis that's been presented, but it seems that the most likely administration plan is to never acknowledge that the negotiations they're engaged in are not going to result in a satisfactory agreement. And it appears, from having attended the Senate hearing yesterday, that they will seek additional continuances. And it's only if the Democrats and Republicans in Congress put a stop to these talks by imposing new sanctions that we have a chance. But I'm somewhat pessimistic, because the example of the Arab-Israeli dispute has been that people are loath to admit that negotiations are not going to solve a problem. So the question is, what other dynamics, if Congress does not act, can we use to bring the facts that Iran is continuing its development of the materials necessary to a nuclear weapon to the attention of the American public post-June, assuming that Congress does not succeed in putting a crimp in the President's plan?
Do I need to repeat the question? Well, let me do it. The observation has been made, which I think was attested to by our distinguished panel, that this isn't working out. These negotiations are not, in fact, reducing the problem of a nuclear capability in Iran, nor really can they. But if the administration doesn't find some kind of constraint, it will continue to do what it's done to date, which is just extend the deadline again and again. In the absence of Congress imposing a deadline, I think the question was, what else can be done under these circumstances. Anybody care to tackle that? Fred? Maybe you better come up here because I think this is where the mics are, if I'm not mistaken.
I think the main focus has to be putting pressure on Congress for sanctions. I don't see any other way of rolling back the Iranian program before the election of a new president. And I think we're very close to a veto-proof majority in Congress. I wish it was here now. There's signs we might have it in March. And I think all Americans who are worried about the Iranian nuclear program, you need to talk to your representative. You need to call your representative's office and make it clear these talks are a disaster. You realize that the Obama administration is giving away the store. They have to be stopped, and the best way to stop them is tough sanctions on Iran. If we pass tough sanctions on Iran, I think Iran will pull out of the talks and save the Obama administration from itself.
Andy?
I think there's got to be a complementary strategy. I think what Fred said is perfectly reasonable. But actually, when Claire showed that quote from Matt Kroenig, from Dr. Kroenig, I had asked him to provide it, to update the situation as it existed after the November 24th, 2014 extension of what had been announced originally in 2013 was made public. So in other words, the negotiations were going to be pushed forward through almost July, it seems, in terms of finalization. And that's when Matt, who had been very skeptical about Israel's capability, conceded that it really needed to strike in the near term as a temporizing measure, and when hopefully there'd be, a change of administrations, perhaps even more broadly a change in policy ideas, so that a more comprehensive strike could be launched. Because short of that, I don't really see how you're going to reverse this program, as Admiral Lyons was suggesting. So I think in reality, the pressure needs to be applied to Israel too, because they are really going to be the first recipient potentially of this existential threat. And the idea that's still being bandied about that somehow Israel should facilitate a change of regime in short of a military action, I don't know how they would do that at any rate. But when you look at what the ideologies are of the Green Movement from Mousavi on down, they have the same basic desires. They are very pro-nuclear in terms of, they always say it's peaceful nukes. They are virulently anti-Western and anti-Israel. I don't really think that that's a viable option, unfortunately. It's not to say that there doesn't exist in Iran a secular population. It's heavily outnumbered at this point.
Thank you. In the back of the room?
Yeah, Tom Trento. For the Admiral, what does day 2 look like after a physical strike on the assets of Iran?
You mean the one that we're proposing that Israel takes now, or?
Yes.
As the former Secretary of Defense said, it'll buy us about 2 years. And I think the way the situation is today, I'll take those 2 years. I don't think we can afford to wait until a potential change in administration. And let me hasten to add, I'm not 100% sure with a change in administration that the appropriate action will be taken. We haven't done it for the past 35 years, so suddenly to pat yourself on the back and say, well, we've now got the right formula, that remains to be seen.
What's the Iranian response going to be?
The Iranian response will be activating most likely a number of their cells throughout the world. We can expect various, if they're all they are, the leading state sponsor of terrorism. What I would do along with the Israeli strike, of course, I would be part of it. I'd be leading it. But that isn't going to happen. But what we should be doing is taking out those Iranian missile sites in Venezuela. That will send a very definite message. You can't let those sites continue to exist.
Thank you, sir. Yes, sir.
What else do we know?
Identify yourself, please.
I'm sorry. Michael Hain, Alliance for Vigilance. What else do we know about the agreement between Russia and Iran?
Claire, do you want to take that?
Well, we don't actually know a whole lot about what they agreed to. We know that the visit took place. We know that an agreement took place. We can see them in, press release photos, signing and shaking hands. At this point, it's really speculation about the fact that, the S-300 might be offered finally to be delivered after the first agreement to deliver in 2010 was canceled, or an updated version, the S-400. We know that Iran has been pressuring Russia to obtain these systems. We don't really know what's in the agreement. That's the bottom line.
Nothing good.
Probably not, no.
That's for sure. Yes, sir.
Roger Aronoff, Accuracy in Media. How does the Obama administration balance the influence, the lobbying pressure from the Iranian side, the Shiites, and the Muslim Brotherhood, the Sunni side, which we obviously know they have advisors and lobbyists working both sides of that. So how do they reconcile that and keep each side happy?
Let me take a cut at that, and then maybe, Claire, you want to speak to it. The question is, how does the administration manage a balancing act between keeping the Iran lobby happy on the one hand and keeping the Muslim Brotherhood lobby happy on the other? The answer seems to be to try to do whatever both want. And if that means at some points, bringing about a policy that is completely incoherent, at least as seen from the perspective of people who are on one side or the other of this Sunni-Shiite split, never mind. We've had just today a report in the Washington Free Beacon about the high-level delegation of Muslim brothers brought into the State Department yesterday. We have had, as Claire has documented, this outfit, NIAC, all over the administration. There are reports that Valerie Jarrett is one of their particular favorites inside the wire, as they say. But the Brotherhood's penetration of this administration, NIAC's influence operations inside this administration, I think help contribute to a profound truth that is not often spoken of in this town or any place else. And that is, we've switched sides in this so-called war on terror. We are now aligned with those who are enemies of this country, be they Shiite, be they Sunni, be they Islamic State or Taliban or Boko Haram, I'm afraid, certainly the al-Nusra Front, the Muslim Brotherhood most especially, the Iranians of various stripes. And this is a dirty little secret. This is part of the untruth that we believed it was important to try to contest with the factual information that we've marshaled here. Claire, do you want to, anything to that?
Let me just say, ergo treason.
I was afraid you'd say that.
The fact that this is not so much more tremendously obvious to everyone observing it as it is to us is surprising to me. I think that what we saw as this administration of ours came into office in 2009 was a plan, an agenda already established to withdraw from Muslim lands. Now, that, of course, is in keeping with Islamic doctrine of infidels out of Islamic lands. Whether this administration intended it to be that way or not, the plan was to withdraw, certainly militarily from Iraq and Afghanistan, but even maybe more importantly, in terms of power and influence from the Middle East. And that is what we've done. And I think, Roger, to your question really, which was about how in the world do they balance this, I think what they decided to try to do was to cede the aftermath of that withdrawal evenly to Islamic powers. And so in North Africa, during the Islamic uprising that some people inexplicably still want to call the Arab Spring, we saw the United States withdraw support for the secular regimes of Ben Ali in Tunisia and Gaddafi in Libya and Mubarak in Egypt, and all of them underwent revolution, and those leaders were toppled. In Libya, of course, as you know, we at the Center for Security Policy, Ace Lyons, too, with us, have documented in a great deal of detail. We actually ran guns, or at least assisted, facilitated the running of guns to al-Qaeda militias that were fighting to overthrow Gaddafi and eventually succeeded in doing that. We very physically involved ourselves in helping al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood to take out what formerly had been an ally of ours, Muammar Gaddafi. In Egypt, you know, to this day, as Frank just said, our administration continues to support the Muslim Brotherhood. They were at the State Department with a delegation yesterday. So I think North Africa was meant to be for the Sunnis. Now, things haven't turned out exactly as perhaps they thought they would. But the Middle East heartland, the Persian Gulf area and beyond, I think was set aside for the Shiites. And that was the balance. That was going to be the balance. You know, as this book that I've mentioned by Robert Baer talks about, there's no question in my mind anymore that the Persian Gulf region was intended from the beginning to be ceded to Iran's hegemony for their takeover, their power to rule, and we see that happening right now. The lobbies, fascinating to watch these lobbies. I never thought I'd see the day that the Saudi oil lobby would be bested by the Persian Shiite lobby, but in a lot of ways, in that heartland area of the Persian Gulf, and that map I had up there on the map before, on the screen before, shows just how the Persians, the Iranians, have succeeded with their agenda, with this administration, at least in that part of the world.
Thank you. I would just mention that, in case this had escaped your attention, the oil is all in the Persian Gulf, not in North Africa. So this is not much of a deal for the Sunnis. Yes, sir.
Russ Reed, Endowment for Middle East Truth. This is a general question for the panel. We talked a lot about the Israeli option to do the strike here, but I've actually had some interesting conversations with former Special Forces, IDF. A lot of guys who kind of have a more practical understanding of what that would take. And the constant agreement that them and I have came to is that it's not a question of can they or will they, it is a question of can they. It seems right now that the Israeli Air Force, which I'm guessing it would have to be an airstrike of some kind, would not necessarily be capable or have the capability to reach these areas. So I would be curious to just hear your thoughts on what they need to be provided with, i.e. the massive ordnance penetrators. Some people have told me that it would take upwards of a stealth capability of some kind, which as far as I know they do not have. So I would just be curious to hear what that solution could look like, if possible.
Well, one of the first things...
Come up here, sir, please.
Of course, one of the first things that would make the strike more effective is providing the necessary tanker support. That is right up #1 priority. And of course, some of the electronics and the suppression weapons, but certainly the bunker buster. That should be provided. Us providing it, let me just tell you, would send a message to Tehran. And I got to tell you, the ambassador just mentioned how the impact of when we shot down, the Vincennes was the cruiser that shot down the civilian airliner. And my standing orders then to our forces were, you will not take the first hit, and I will back you up. And I'm sure that was part of what happened there. But the result was dramatic. The Ayatollah said, I have to drink from the chalice of poison. And he signed the truce. So think of where we... So, yes, I think Israel, difficult? Yes. But there are enough elements that can be put together which could make a very impressive strike.
Claire?
There are generally agreed to be 4 main facilities in the Iranian nuclear weapons program that are core, that are key to its ability to continue that program. They are the conversion facility at Isfahan, 2 nuclear enrichment sites, one at Natanz, one at Fordow, or sometimes called Qom, because it's near that city, and the Arak plutonium heavy water reactor. Now, of those, both Isfahan and Arak are above ground. No problem for Israel. Natanz is buried at a depth underground. The enrichment halls, there are 2 of them where the centrifuges are positioned, at a depth that current Israeli ordnance likely can reach and destroy. At the very minimum, could collapse the entryways to those facilities. The one that is probably out of reach for the Israelis with what they have capabilities right now is Fordow, because it's under a mountain. I mean, literally 200 and some feet under a mountain, hard rock. For that, yeah, the massive ordnance penetrator, they would need something like that, and they probably have the ability to do this, successive multiple strikes, in other words, down the same hole, burrowing, as it were, down. But 3 out of the 4 of those major facilities are within Israeli capability probably right now. They do have refueling capability in air. And, as we've said, these 4 are key. You take these 4 out, Iran does not have a program anymore. But, will they do it?
Of course, I'd add a 5th target, Guam.
Can I just say that the issue that I raised a moment ago adds to the complexity of this challenge of successfully degrading, let alone destroying, this program. The unknown unknowns, I think, as Don Rumsfeld used to call it, in terms of what they have concealed that has not yet been disclosed, is another level of complication. There's no getting around that. I think it's safe to assume that, like the ones that you've mentioned, Claire, that are buried underground, so are the concealed ones. I had someone brief me earlier this week on the topography of Iran, and it is really something to behold when you see the Zagros Mountains that essentially ring the country. Which means you not only need, the legs to get there from a place like Israel, if in fact that's your launch point. You've got to have the ability to get up and over very high mountains without detection, and then get down into very deep valleys where these underground facilities have been located to make them very difficult to hit from the air. So this is a hard thing, and I just wanted to add my 2 bits on this. It is, frankly, recklessly irresponsible, not to say morally repugnant, for the United States of America, which has at least as much on the line as we've heard this afternoon, as does Israel, in terms of the future survival of this nation, that we hope an important and quite powerful, but let's face it, much less powerful friend and ally of ours will do what we refrain from doing. Now, like my colleagues, I think I'm under no illusion about the character of the present administration. But mark my words, what we're describing here is an existential threat to the people and nation of America. And at some point, I pray to God it will not be before that existential threat has fully metastasized, perhaps in the form of an electromagnetic pulse attack that takes down the grid of this country and essentially reduces us to a pre-industrial nation. But at some point, it is going to become evident to every American that not only have we been lied to about the nature of this regime, the feasibility of negotiating successfully with it, and the prospects for an outcome that will eliminate that existential threat. That we ourselves have a responsibility to deal with this danger ourselves. And I pray we do it with the Israelis, but I certainly think the Israelis should not have to do it alone. With that, we are about out of time,
Let me say one other thing.
but we have,
Attacks on Israel today with Hezbollah?
we spoke a little bit about it, but you can ask that question after the Admiral speaks.
There's one group that we've left out of this entire discussion, and it's the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And I've written about this. You know, they could have tremendous political impact if they could overcome their political correctness. I mean, when they act as a corporate body and say, Mr. President, enough is enough, we're not going with you. They have the power that I believe can change the equation and the situation we face. How you bring that about, that's another question. But they do have it. And it's somehow, I would hope that they can stand up and look at themselves in the mirror in the morning and say, I did everything I possibly could.
Another question?
Yes.
Would you identify yourself, please?
Mark Campbell with United West. There's actually a bunch of people online that are talking about this, about the attacks on Israel today from Lebanon with Hezbollah. Anybody would like to comment that for our listeners online?
Fred, do you want to say anything about it, or Claire?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, a couple of us alluded to this, that, Israel conducted a strike against a Iranian Hezbollah convoy about a week ago or so, killing senior Iranian officials and also Hezbollah. One of the senior regime officials, military officials within the Iranian Tehran regime, has spoken to the media, calling that a red line that Israel has crossed. And so the first retaliation, as you mentioned, Mark, apparently occurred this morning with missile launch that hit the IDF up in the northern part of Israel and killed at least 2. I've also seen reports perhaps 4 IDF troops. And this is the sort of retaliation I think that we can expect to go on for the next few days, if not weeks, some tit for tat. Again, as I say, I think the Iranians and Hezbollah do not want to accelerate this at the moment because they are in such a tight position with extending their forces in Syria. But it's a delicate, it's a sensitive moment because either side really could trigger something that steps over a line, even inadvertently, at a time like this.
Let me close with one observation, really speaking to the point that Admiral Lyons just made, and you heard it from a former member of the sort of extended Joint Chiefs of Staff as the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations. Anytime you look at a problem like this, do not underestimate the ability of even small numbers of people to make profound differences. It's obvious that people with 4 stars on their shoulders are in a position to do it rather easier than many of us. But Claire's comment and her characterization of what happened today and in recent days on the Golan reminds me of one of our war stories at the Center for Security Policy. In 1994, then President Bill Clinton and then Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin were that close to engineering the withdrawal of Israeli forces from their defensive positions atop the Golan and the insertion in their stead of U.S. troops. And the center helped pull together another Tiger team. Admiral Lyons, I think, was still on active duty at the time, otherwise we would have grabbed him. But we did have, I think, 5 four-star retired military officers of great distinction, and 4, as I recall, former senior civilians, who came together and said, this is a crazy idea. This will be detrimental to not only the security of the State of Israel, which must rely upon its own capacity to contend with threats from Hafiz Assad or Bashar Assad or any of the successors to that regime that are now in prospect. And the United States cannot be relied upon under circumstances like those that you could predict, let alone today's, to keep forces in what could very easily become a real meat grinder. Fortunately, the report that we issued was sufficiently problematic that it bought time. The Admiral spoke of 2 years. This was a matter of weeks as it happened. Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated shortly after. It had nothing to do with the report, needless to say, but his assassination put that whole proposition on ice. But the point is, each of us now, having been exposed to these truths, and these are not simply assertions or the, imaginings of these folks. Each of them are expert in their field, and their views should be considered authoritative in their own right, to be sure. But they are also drawing, as they do, as serious practitioners of the business of the war of ideas, with documented information, much of it from government sources. These truths should be considered self-evident. And empowered by them, I am hoping that everyone here and everyone who has had an opportunity to view this will go forward with the understanding that this is our time to try to ensure that this threat does not fully metastasize, and in the process perhaps imperil all of us and everyone we love. So with that as an admonition, an injunction, and hopefully a bit of a pep talk, go forth and multiply. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to this excellent team. Well done.